So what is the inferior cognitive function? The cognitive attitude of the inferior function is lost, missing, repressed, indulgent, avoidant. It's like a crutch. That's where our addictions are, our fears, insecurities, our sensitivities. It's a touchy and defensive type of energy. We tend to try to protect it. And this is where our desires can be when we get bored with our ego. It can be very mysterious, blissful, childish, naive, extreme, delusional, and cause neurosis. So the inferior function, we roughly develop that at age 35. The inferior function is our most painful pressure point within our ego's cognition. It's like our nuclear power button. Where everything is on fire, burn it to the ground, where we find our internal and external issues magnified. Our inferior function is the gateway into our demon function or unconscious superego when triggered. But if we can develop the inferior function and not get triggered, we will begin to develop our subconscious, and that is considered our moon sign astrologically. So psychologically, the four sides of the mind, that's the ego, subconscious, unconscious, and superego. And then astrologically, you've got your sun sign, which is your the month you were born and day. And then you have your subconscious, which is your moon sign, and that is based on your location of your birth. And then I sprinkle in Mars and Saturn within our unconscious. And then our superego is considered our rising sign astrologically. And that is actually based on the time that we were born, which is extremely important. I will eventually get into all of that. So this is where our fears and insecurities exist within the inferior cognitive function. We tend to cover up our insecurities with pride. And this is where we are the most vain, where we will find hatred for other people if they're hammering at our inferior, and where we go immediately to blows. The inferior function is very difficult to control. All one can do is bring awareness to it and practice wielding it every day to make it stronger. So it's kind of like building a muscle. So because of its relative unconsciousness, the inferior function is most responsible for really many of our childish, naive, extreme, or delusional thoughts and behaviors. Despite its ability to distort, exaggerate, or idealize reality, the inferior function is still hard to resist because it can be so blissful through strong feelings and infatuation, for example. It can easily become a source of addiction. Like all addictions, it may inspire obsessive, compulsive, or otherwise unhealthy behaviors. When we are in the inferior grip, we may get locked into certain moods, attitudes, or behaviors that are not easily escaped. We may also become increasingly narrow-minded, irrational, self-indulgent, and irritable. So like any addiction, what begins with a sense of intense pleasure can eventually take a turn for the worst. According to analytical psychology, repression of mental activities to the unconscious mind tends to produce maladaptive tendencies. The longer and more intense the period of repression, the more likely it is that the boundary between the unconscious and conscious breaks down. When unconscious pressure remains high due to prolonged and intense repression, it will find some form of release eventually, whether through a healthy or an unhealthy means. So it's kind of like, you know how they say you need to feed your demons, you know, keep them caged, but feed them every now and then so they don't burst out and totally take over and like destroy the world and everything that you love and even yourself. So it's kind of like that. One of the four functions, inferior, is the closest in proximity to the unconscious mind. So it's the easiest function to hijack for releasing unconscious pressures when a person is mentally exhausted. This causes a person to act really out of character, for the period of time that their mental energy remains exhausted due to the oppositional nature of the inferior. As a child approaches prepubescence, 10 to 12, they tend to overuse the dominant hero function, which in turn exacerbates the inferior. So you are repressing your inferior and you are totally dominant in your hero cognitive function, which is extroverted thinking. So the tension between the dominant and the inferior reaches a critical point at that time. Unless there is some way to relieve the tension, the mind becomes increasingly fragile, unstable, and susceptible to inferior distortion. Parents often notice their child behaving more erratically during this period. So I do have a 13-year-old, and she's a Cancer, so she is FE dominant and TI inferior. And I'm definitely noticing this within her. So if type development stalls because the tension between the dominant and hero and inferior functions is never properly addressed, a person is likely to show more and more serious signs of personality disorders over time. In order to gain proper access to your subconscious or a moon sign, you have to develop your inferior function and turn it into an aspirational one. If you do not do this, you will endure a midlife crisis and your mind will force development whether you like it or not. Aspiration is faith and confidence. To make your inferior function more aspirational, you have to let go of your insecurities and fears by gaining more experiences outside of your comfort zone with personal development in mind. You will be at your happiest when your subconscious side of your mind is developed.